Inequality, the 1% solution. My colleagues and I have something in common. We both think concentrations of power in alliances between gargantuan business institutions and gargantuan government institutions are generally terrible. My colleague and I do not have much in common in how we analyze the formation of those concentrations of power, or what we think should be done about them. Another thing my colleague and I have in common is that we each think the other guy's approach to this problem is hopelessly naive. And another thing we don't have in common is that I largely agreed with Joseph Stiglitz's article in Vanity Fair, which my colleague described as an example of self-refutingly absurd liberal ideology. To sum up the basic thrust of what I agree with in Mr. Stiglitz's piece, I think the rich are getting much richer, while regular people in the developed world, which is what we are talking about here, are at best treading water. I think that wealth brings power, and the fact that the rich are getting much richer relative to everyone else means that the rich also exert increasing influence over the economy, government, and society. I think income mobility and equality of opportunity have declined in America over the past 40 years, to the point where America is now more segregated by class divisions than many European countries. I think a major reason for these shifts has been the increasing dominance since the Reagan era of an ideology that is indifferent to or actively celebrates inequality of income. I think this is ideology I think this ideology is bad. Bad for the economy, bad for society, bad for art and culture, bad for the moral character of those who subscribe to it. My chief difference with Mr. Stiglitz is that I think his confidence that inequality will eventually lead to a vociferous political reaction against wealthy financial elites in America is misplaced. I'm going to get to more fundamental issues, but first I have to address my colleague's reference to a post by Scott Winship that claims that Mr. Stiglitz got all his numbers wrong. The first claim on that post is that the top 1% of American earners take in not nearly a quarter of all American income, as Mr. Stiglitz says, but 18% of all income, according to figure by Emmanuel Saez and Thomas Piketty, respected economists. But a commenter quickly notes that Mr. Winship made a mistake here. He used Messer Saez and Piketty figures for income not including capital gains. This is like saying that the Queen of England doesn't really earn that much if you don't count the money the state pays to maintain her palaces and cover her servants, food, clothes, parties and travel. The top 1% earn a large and increasing portion of their income from capital gains. It's my understanding that for hedge fund managers, the entirety of their income is counted as capital gains due to the carried interest rule. Mr. Winship has a number of other problems with Mr. Stiglitz's figures, and I don't know whose figures are better, but I'm confident that on each of these claims, an argument between Mr. Winship and Mr. Stiglitz is going to come down to an abstruse conflict over different datasets. There is simply no way that Joseph Stiglitz inserted, say, the figure that top 1% Americans controlled 40% of country's wealth off the top of his head. And all the authorities Mr. Winship cites also agree that inequality of income has grown markedly in America over the past 30 years. Arguing over percentages seems to me, to quote Mr. Stiglitz, like an effort to pretend that what has obviously happened has not in fact happened. More importantly, I don't understand why my colleague, who professes to be rather indifferent to the level of inequality in society, cares whether the top 1% take in 18% or 25% of national income. I tend to think that the fact that defenders of inequality spend so much time trying to fight back on these stats suggests that they are not so confident that there is nothing morally wrong with yawning differences in wealth or with extraordinary portions of overall income being harvested by those at the very tip of the pyramid. But a wise blogger once said it's a good principle to argue about other people's main points, not to quibble over side issues. So let me get to the main thrust of my colleague's point about the liberal Ouroboros. He argues that the financial governmental complex is a new version of the military industrial complex, which itself is still very much perniciously in business. The problem is that we are multiplying military industrial complexes, but this explosion in public-private partnerships and the inevitable political corruption and economic distortion they produce is not at the bottom due to a plot of top 1%. It is due in no small part to the success of progressive ideologies like Mr. Stiglitz in arguing for ever greater government control over everything. I cannot find any way to make sense of this argument. Here are some examples of bad public-private partnerships: the growth in outsourcing of military and intelligence mission to private security contracts like Blackwater Xe, the semi-private for-profit but implicitly state-guaranteed status of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, implicit government bailout guarantees for too-big-to-fail financial institutions such as Citibank, AIG, et al. In the first case, defense and intelligence were formerly government monopolies, and the explosion in extremely profitable outsourcing was a result of the privatization mania of the 1980s, driven by radical right free enterprise fanatics like Eric Prince. Government control over the military has decreased, not increased, and that trend is certainly not the fault of progressive ideologies. In the case of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, LBJ's decision to privatize them was driven by a desire to minimize the government's balance sheet, and has little ideological character. Had they remained straight-up government agencies as they were from the 1930s to the late 60s, they would have played an even more marginal role in the financial crisis. You certainly can't argue that their public-private character resulted from a drive for ever greater government control over everything. It was the opposite. In the case of implicit government guarantees for TBTFs, the problem was precisely a lack of explicit rules for government's role regarding systematically important financial institutions, particularly non-bank institutions. The only way to argue that the problem here is too much liberal-driven government involvement would be to argue that we should a. do away with the federal deposit insurance and the rest of the New Deal Basel underpinning of the modern financial system every as they obtain in every developed country, and b. that we should have let the banks, insurers and hedge funds all fail in September 2008. This would not be a serious position, and I'm sure my colleagues doesn't hold it. I cannot think of any field in which the growth of public-private partnerships results from progressive ideologies arguing that ever greater government control over everything. In every case I can think of, the growth of public-private partnerships is linked to the Washington Consensus era belief of both conservatism and neoliberal ideologies that anything government can do, the private sector can do better. For that matter, there are plenty of examples of really great public-private partnerships like many character schools and build, operate, transfer deals to get roads, railways, bridges and airports built more efficiently than they might be if done by government. Anyway, the point is that trying to describe the history of the past 30 years with its great growth in inequality and increasing influence of money on politics as one of the increasingly progressive ideology leading to growing government intervention in the economy seems to me possibly far-fetched.